Okay, class, this is going to be the first lecture over Darwin's theory of evolution. So I'm bringing the PowerPoint up so you can see it right here. And if you want to type your notes in as you're listening to this, you can, but you don't have to do that. It's probably even more important that you just listen to the lecture, especially because you're going to be receiving a passcode sometime during this lecture. And you'll have to use that passcode to submit the assignment so that I know you actually watched the lecture. Okay, so let's talk about this. This is section 16-1. So there are three sections in this chapter, chapter 16. Okay, so as you see here, it says Darwin filled his notebooks with observations about the characteristics and habitats of the different species he saw. So before we went on break, uh, I was going to show you guys a video over Darwin and what he did. So he took a voyage on the Beagle, which was a ship, and he went in all over the world. But one of the places he went and gathered the most data at was the Galapagos Islands. Very interesting islands because they have a bunch of very unique organisms on those islands. And what makes them so unique is that these islands are kind of separated off from the mainland. So the organisms change based on the habitat that they live on each island. Okay, so we're going to go through this and kind of see why the Galapagos were so important for Darwin's collection of his data that he had to eventually develop his theory of evolution. So it says here that he filled his notebooks with lots of information, and a lot of that came from the Galapagos. So he wanted to explain the biological diversity he observed in a scientific way. Remember, the scientific method always starts with an observation first. So you look, you see something, and you're like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Okay. And then the next part of that is to kind of develop a hypothesis about why you think that maybe that is happening that way, or maybe that's why it's occurring. So that's why he started looking at patterns into which his observations might fit. So these are the three primary things or patterns that he noticed of biological diversity. Remember, biological diversity is the different types of life, okay? All life, any living thing. And in biology A, you should have discussed what was considered living and what's not living. But let's talk about the three things, these three distinctive patterns. Well, we know that species vary globally. We know that species vary locally, and then species vary over time. But we also have to understand what a species is. It's very important that you understand what the definition of a species is. And I did mention this in class during lecture. A species, remember, is defined as any organism. And when I use the term organism, I don't mean individual. I'm referring to the species. Okay, so like a wolf or something like that. That's not a very specific species, but let's just use the wolf. Any species that can mate and reproduce and make fertile offspring. Now, it has to be that, and it has to be very clear. So it's not just that they can mate and reproduce, it's that their babies or their offspring can also do that. In the example that I gave you in class, where they were not members of the same species, but they were able to mate and reproduce, is a donkey and a horse, right? A donkey and a horse can mate and reproduce. They can make a mule, but mules are sterile. You cannot mate two mules and get another mule. Now, what that tells us about a donkey and a horse is they are related enough on the evolutionary ladder to be able to mate and to produce offspring, but they're not related closely enough to produce fertile offspring. Therefore, they are not members of the same species. Now, that goes for most sexually reproducing organisms. Asexually reproducing organisms, that's quite different. There may be a little bit different definitions from that, but Darwin was looking at animals and plants, basically. That's what he was looking at. At that time, they didn't have the advanced technology that we have today. Okay, so species can vary globally. We know that. There are different animals in different places in the world, and they are actually designed to live in those areas because they've been there for a long time. And their populations will change over time if the environment changes. Okay, they can also vary locally. So we have different types of populations of organisms right here, okay, right there in Laporte. And of course, they vary over time. This is the part, this third one, where we're kind of talking about evolution itself. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Let's talk specifically more about how species vary globally. So Darwin noticed that different yet ecologically similar animal species inhabited separated but ecologically similar habitats around the globe. Okay, so what this is saying is their areas were separated. However, the type of area that they lived in was similar. And what we found out, and what we're beginning to find out because of that, we have similar organisms on the planet that look very, very similar, even though they don't have a common ancestor. Ostriches are a good example. There's also emus and there's rheas. Okay, and that's what they're going to give you here. All three of those are very similar. Okay, but they're in different areas. But because the environment was the same in those areas, those organisms developed in similar ways. Okay, so let's read on and see what this says. Darwin found flightless ground-dwelling birds called rheas living in the grasslands of South America. Okay, so down in South America. Rheas look and act a lot like ostriches, yet rheas live only in South America, and ostriches live only in Africa. When Darwin visited Australia's grasslands, he found another large flightless bird called the emu. And they look very similar, so you would think that, they're all kind of the same bird, but they're not, and they're different species. So what that means is they're not able to produce fertile offspring, if they can produce offspring at all. Okay, Darwin also noticed that rabbits and other species living in European grasslands were missing from the grasslands of South America and Australia. Australia's grasslands were home to kangaroos and other animals that were found nowhere else. What did these patterns of geographic distribution mean? Now, Australia is another unique place. Okay, but the Galapagos is by far even more unique than Australia. But Australia does have all the cute mammals. Those are the ones that we really like, the cute, unique mammals like koalas. Those are the really cute ones. Okay, kangaroos, wallabies. There's lots of different ones there. Okay, how about the species vary locally? So Darwin noticed that different yet related animal species often occupy different habitats within a local area. So for example, he found two species of rheas living in South America, one in Argentina's grasslands and the other in the colder, harsher grasslands and scrubland to the south. So they were different yet related. Okay, so what that's telling him, even though they were related, they must have changed over time a little bit because they still were somewhat different. And that's because they occupied different habitats. Now, the habitat is going to involve the temperature. It's going to involve the types of organisms that live there, plants, animals, all of that. Seasonal rainfall, anything that you can imagine that the habitat would be subjected to. Okay, so Darwin saw differences among the giant land tortoises that inhabit the Galapagos Islands, and I did show you a video with that. And learned the island's governor that the tortoises' shells varied in predictable ways from one island to another. In the video I showed you, if you guys remember, some of the tortoises did not have a peaked dome because they didn't need it. They lived in an area on the Galapagos where they could eat the grass right off of the ground. But when you went to a different area, there were tortoises there that had the peaked dome that allowed their neck to extend up very high so that their head could get to the cactus fruit or the flowers that were on there so they could eat it, because there weren't or wasn't much grass, if any, on the ground at all. So that's, beginning to tell us that maybe there were both types of tortoises in both areas. And the ones that were most fit are the ones that survived. And those traits got passed on, so we ended up with all of them looking like that. And that's kind of, a summation of evolution. So the shape of the tortoise's shells corresponds to different habitats. Isabella Island has high peaks, is rainy, and has abundant vegetation that is close to the ground. A tortoise from Isabella Island has a dome-shaped shell and a short neck. Okay, and then Hood Island, in contrast, is flat, dry, and has sparse vegetation. A long neck and a shell that is curved and open around the neck and legs allow the Hood Island tortoise to reach sparse high vegetation, like on the cactus in the video I was showing you guys. Okay, now I'm going to give you guys the passcode that you will have to submit with this video lecture assignment. The passcode for this is going to be snowfall. Okay, so write that down, and then when you go to submit the assignment, just type the word snowfall in, and then you guys will get points for it. Okay, moving on. Darwin also observed that different islands had different varieties of mockingbirds. You can see here that they have different shaped beaks. Okay, this one is a very thick, large beak. This one is long and thin. It looks like it might be able to puncture something. And this one was like a hook-shaped beak. Now, what's interesting is, and I think everyone can tell me, which beak do you think is the strongest? Definitely this beak, right? So let's say that there were some nuts that were very hard to crack on that island. Which bird do you think would be best at doing that? For sure, this bird. But what if the only food that was available, or most of the food that was available, was deep inside of like rotting trees or something? This long one would probably have the best shot of getting in there and getting grubs or whatever types of organisms, mites or whatever, ants that might be living in there. And then for the hooked one might be good for getting worms out of the ground, okay, something like that. So he noticed that the different islands had different varieties of mockingbirds, all which resembled mockingbirds he had seen in South America. In addition, Darwin noticed several types of small brown birds on the islands with beaks of different shapes. He didn't consider these smaller birds to be unusual or important. At first is the key here. Okay, it took him a little while. So let's look at this. Darwin also collected fossils. So when he found some fossils, he collected them, which is good, which are the preserved remains or traces of ancient organisms. He noticed that some fossils of extinct animals were similar to living species. An example here would be this glyptodon, 3 meters long, very similar to an armadillo today, which is only 0.5 meters long. Very similar. One set of fossils unearthed by Darwin belonged to the long extinct glyptodon, a giant armored animal similar to the armadillo. Darwin wondered if the armadillo might be related to the ancient glyptodon. Darwin began to wonder whether different Galapagos species might have evolved from South American ancestors. Now, that's interesting because the Galapagos Islands are basically right here, okay? That's close to South America. So there is a chance that some of these species maybe were able to get over there. Or if at one time this land was part of South America, they were already there and then it broke off, okay? So regardless, birds could fly there anyway. Okay. So he spent several years actively researching and filling notebooks with ideas about species and evolution. The evidence suggested that species are not fixed and that they could change by some natural process. That natural process basically is called natural selection, okay, which leads us up to the theory of evolution. Okay, so that concludes section 16.1. I'm going to post that for you guys today. Hopefully you have time to watch it before Friday or Friday at the end of the day. Okay? Thank you.